Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. For many wrestling fans, particularly those who were teenagers during the Attitude Era, we often look to WWF No Mercy as the greatest wrestling game of all time. Aki Asmik's magnum opus that on the Nintendo 64 offered an awesome pick up and play 4-player experience that captured the zeitgeist of the period. However, those who have been wrestling fans since the golden era of the World Wrestling Federation, they may look to another title as their all-time favourite. The game I am of course referring to is the 4-player arcade exclusive known as WWF Wrestlefest, a Technos Japan game that successfully managed to immortalise the cartoonish rock and roll wrestling age of the business. This excellent game stunned players with its Hasbro action figure-like presentation, and with the title of course only being found in arcades, this would mean that gamers get even more teary-eyed about this one than usual, as players couldn't take it home. To capitalise on the love and nostalgia that many hold for this game, in 2012 a Wrestlefest sequel featuring a very similar art style would hit the market. However, nearly a decade on, few now remember this game and what it contained. In today's video we are going to look back at this mysterious title, what it brought to the table, and why we can no longer play it. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of the Delisted Wrestlefest sequel. Yeah! 2012, a year that many of us probably remember for the Olympic Games in London, or the predicted global apocalypse that we never seem to actually have happen until 2020. However, if you are a professional wrestling fan, then you probably remember this time frame as the year that Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson returned from Hollywood to take on the new biggest name in professional wrestling, John Cena. The match that was cheekily billed as once in a lifetime, despite the frickin' pair facing off again literally just a short 12 months later, created a lot of intrigue. You see, after the Attitude Era ended and WWE got the F out, many long-term fans had grown tired of the company, largely due to their shift towards becoming a PG product, so that they could attract a younger audience and chase more lucrative, family-friendly sponsors. For years, John Cena was strongly positioned as the face of the company, almost becoming the Super Mario or Mickey Mouse of the wrestling promotion's branding. Big Match John would rarely ever lose, and older fans didn't appreciate his whiter than white Superman-like image. Bringing back The Rock to face him at WrestleMania would not just present the superstar of a worthy challenger, but it was a move that would ignite the interest of those who grew up in the Attitude Era, who were craving to see flickers of the past in the product. This bout that attracted interest from various age demographics led to the most watched wrestling pay-per-view in years, further proving that nostalgia is big business. A well that the WWE continue to heavily dip their toe into to this day, with elderly stars such as Goldberg wrestling for promotion as recently as this year. As for 2012 though, The Rock would not be the only thing that would finally come back to the WWE, as the WrestleFest gaming brand would also make a shocking return. As mentioned earlier, there is a whole generation of gamers and wrestling fans who are nostalgic for the arcade classic, so it made perfect, lucrative sense to attempt to profit from WrestleFest once more. The game's first trailer would depict a CGI moving image of an arcade cabinet, featuring cartoon-like graphics of The Rock and various WWE superstars, past and present, grappling and performing all of their signature moves for the virtual audience's enjoyment. The voiceover in this promotional material states, "You've demanded it for decades and the classic WWE arcade game WrestleFest is available now, featuring the biggest WWE superstars and legends." It then goes on to outline many of the other features that this reinvention of a cult favourite would bring. The 2012 game was announced for PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, Steam, iOS and Android, promising to finally bring a WrestleFest game officially home after all of these years. On a service level, just like the 1991 original, this WrestleFest title was created to simulate professional wrestling matches, once again including support for up to 4 players and more. But considering that this was meant to be a multi-platform sequel to one of the most celebrated wrestling games of all time, whether this title ultimately turned out to be good or bad, why is it talked about so little as of now? You would think that a new WrestleFest should have been recognised as a pretty important moment in gaming history. Well, this is because while the game was scheduled for release on a number of different platforms, the game would see cancellation on all of them but mobile devices, thus meaning that in the end, only those who were willing to dabble in a bit of mobile gaming would ever get to play the new Wrestlefest. The reasoning behind this did not relate to the game's overall quality, but instead the failings of the publisher. THQ, who had replaced Acclaim over a decade earlier as the publisher of WWE's games, were in financial trouble and throughout 2012 became more focused on their financial situation rather than releasing games, with the company soon declaring bankruptcy and being liquidated. Through all of this though, the world would get the mobile version of the game, which would show up in the Apple Store in February of that year. WWE would brag on their website that fans told them to bring back WrestleFest, so they did, claiming that THQ had faithfully recreated the 2D experience available to be played on iPod Touch, iPhone and iPad based devices. They would go on to claim that the well-known WWE arcade game made popular in the 1990s had returned to glory. Danny Bilson, Executive Vice President of Core Games, THQ, would add, WWE Wrestlefest greatly complements our WWE video games portfolio by delivering a unique and captivating way for fans to connect with a virtual WWE experience. The game's arcade-style play, combined with present-day WWE content and hints of nostalgia, is a perfect fit for handheld platforms like the iPhone and iPad. They would go on to comment that the game's roster consists of notable current roster members, combined with some of the company's most popular legends. From the current crop, the game would include John Cena, Randy Orton, Rey Mysterio, The Undertaker, and the returning Rock. However, the title would also include Jake the Snake Roberts, who had previously featured in WrestleFest, and rather curiously, Macho Man Randy Savage, a character who fans got to play as in the first Technos Japan WWF game known as Superstars, who was sadly missing from the action of the 1991 WrestleFest follow-up. This modern mobile game would rectify this issue. The WWE website would add that through their new game that players could explore arcade-style WWE action across a variety of match types, including Royal Rumble, Tag Team, Gauntlet and Steel Cage, while competing in a number of renowned arenas like Raw, SmackDown, WrestleMania and Saturday Night's Main Event. They would also announce that the title's The Road to WrestleMania progression style mode would encourage players to select a WWE superstar or WWE legend to compete with in a series of challenges to win 5 different WWE championships. Further to this, the 4-player action was touted to be possible through the wireless connectivity of the Apple Game Center that would enable gamers to issue multiplayer challenges. Not only that, they would state that the game would continue to be worked on, with the gameplay experience being updated and refined following the launch, with the game's DLC allowing those who had downloaded the app to be able to add an additional 30 WWE superstars and legends to their rosters, as well as many more arenas and other features. Speaking of a game's DLC, it would be aggressively released, month in and month out, with the title even having a DLC pack available to download from day one. Which begs the question, is it really additional content if the extras are as old as the game itself? To me, that looks more like they were simply paywalling elements of the base game, which is pretty scummy really. The characters who were locked behind the paywall on day one would be Shawn Michaels, Triple H, Sheamus, CM Punk and the Big Boss Man. And we also have the Survivor Series Arena, which would be made available as part of the same DLC pack. While we could spend some time individually name dropping each roster member that would be made available over 6 straight frickin' months of DLC, I shall instead mention the legends that were available for download. After all, this was a nostalgia based WrestleFest game, so those are the most important characters, right? I mean really, who wants to play as Alberto Del Rio? Players would get to control Yokozuna, a wrestler from the so-called New Generation era, Kevin Nash, Mr. Perfect, Rowdy Roddy Piper, the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase, and the iconic Hulk Hogan. A WrestleFest game where users were charged extra just to play as the star of WrestleFest of old, Hulk Hogan, probably tells you all you need to know about the spirit of this game. And it's not good. Microtransactions just to unlock characters? That don't work for me, brother. While arcade games have always been about coin munching, I personally do not feel that the majority of them are anywhere near as predatory to consumers as the majority of mobile games. For starters, at least with arcade games, the amount of money you needed to insert was based on your own skill levels, so you always felt that depending on how well you played the game, the longer you got to play it, and the more features you would get to see and experience. Most of these transactions in modern mobile games have zero to do with skill, and instead players are encouraged to pay to unlock parts of a game, be it they are skilled and dedicated to the game or not. The rewarding factor that made Wrestlefest and so many other arcades so special is completely absent from the majority of mobile games, the new Wrestlefest included. While on this moony tangent, I guess it is also worth noting that with arcade games, people are paying to play the state-of-the-art video games available on the market, where with modern mobile games, instead consumers often pay for bottom-of-the-barrel rubbish. But aside from whinging about this game's paywalling and the fact that it only appeared on mobiles, how exactly does this game function? Well, as you would have probably already been able to savvily identify throughout this video, the answer is not very well. While WWE Wrestlefest hit the market 21 years after the original game, somehow, even with all the modern technology that was at the developer's disposal, the new game looks notably worse. For starters, whilst the original offered some of the most beautiful cartoony pixel artwork of the period, the 2012 game instead just looks exactly like other cheap, stereotypical mobile games of its era, with the graphical similarities between the two games not really being particularly there, apart from the fact they chose to make both games look cartoony. For a product designed to capitalise on nostalgia, not a great deal was done to attempt to make the game feel nostalgic. Well, apart from gamers wishing they were playing the arcade original instead. Aside from this, the game offers some of the worst 2D animation I've ever seen, with the characters' movements often being so poor that it looks like they never even got round to drawing the majority of frames for the game. Were THQ and WWE hoping that fans thought that they misremembered how the first Wrestlefest looked? As the animation in this one is not even close to what came long before it. In terms of combat mechanics, the game does take inspiration from the title it is trying to emulate, to be fair. Simple 2-button action, which is of course utilised with a touchscreen. Wrestlers' moves widely vary between the title's roster members. For example, how a superstar responds to being punched during a grapple changes from character to character, countering with a variety of different wrestling moves. The return of the Wrestlefest brand would also see the inclusion of double team moves, which can be executed when tagging in a partner or when one wrestler holds another in a headlock. Wrestlers, when left tagged out on the apron for a while, will power up temporarily, giving them an advantage to win grapples and inflict extra damage when tagged back in, and at least some extra strategy to the game. Like the original, the game also shares an annoying element with its arcade counterpart, one of which is not fondly remembered: cheap, irritating AI, with players often feeling reportedly cheated by this game, with opponents kicking out of everything, even finishers. Long loading times could also make this game a drag at points, and when players are actually grappling, things become very repetitive very fast. Trawling through reviews of the period, reviews of the game are surprisingly kind. I guess no one would have felt too ripped off, with only paying $2.99 for the base game. However, when you calculate the cost of all of the game's upcoming DLC together, the title would have been as expensive as a regular console release. A running theme I've noticed with regards to the kindness shown towards this game is that reviewers were looking forward to the game being polished up for a full console release, something in which we now know we would never actually get to see. Regardless of this game's quality though, it is sad that it was only a matter of time before the iOS version of this game would end up being delisted completely, meaning that it is impossible to purchase it in any capacity today. Meaning we are now in a situation once more where we can't bring a game like this home, legally anyway. Or can we? This year would see the release of Retromania Wrestling by Retrosoft Studios, a game that was directly inspired by Wrestlefest that does a much better job of faithfully recreating the action that can be found in the 1991 classic. Released 30 years after the original, the game even includes the Legion of Doom as playable characters. So if you want to learn more about this one, why not check out my video on the subject which I uploaded to this channel earlier on in the year. I would love to know your thoughts on all of the games mentioned today. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was the story of the Delisted Wrestlefest sequel that was available on iOS and cancelled on other platforms completely. Let me know down in the comments what you thought of today's video, and if you are new here, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell to ensure you see all of my future videos. In fact, if you want to see more from me right now, I have an entire playlist covering wrestling video game history, which includes the likes of Superstars, the original WrestleFest and Retromania, as I mentioned earlier in this video. These videos were in part paid for by the generous donations, or should I say backing, that I receive on Patreon. And one of the latest incentives I've just introduced is I am now answering questions at the end of these videos from various patrons. So I'm going to open my phone right now and read the next question that I have. Today's question is from Matthew Reist, and he says, what's one game that's never been re-released in any form that you would like to see re-released on current platforms? I personally would like to see, not quite sure I can give this as my answer, so I'm about to give you two answers instead. I would really like to see the Virtual Boy game Wario Land re-released on, I think it's called Virtual Wario Land, re-released on the Nintendo 3DS, because I'm sure it'd be far more delightful playing that high quality game on a high quality device rather than playing it using the red goggles of doom with a pair of legs. Now, wouldn't that be lovely? In fact, I find it rather insulting that the 3DS was so popular and Nintendo had the perfect opportunity to put the entire Virtual Boy library over to the system. Like, why did we not get a Virtual Boy collection on a physical Nintendo 3DS cartridge? That would have been awesome, wouldn't it? But like I said, not quite sure I can give that as an answer because the 3DS is not really current gen anymore. So if we're talking about porting an old game from an old system to a new system like the Nintendo Switch or the PlayStation 5, if the PlayStation 5 really exists, that is. What about Alien vs Predator, the first-person shooter that was made for the Atari Jaguar? Why have I given that game as the title I'd like to see ported? Quite simple. I do not own an Atari Jaguar, and by many accounts, Alien vs Predator for that system is its killer app. If you can say the Atari Jaguar has a killer app, that is. So yeah, the Atari Jaguar is notoriously difficult to emulate, so in order to play the game you really need to own an Atari Jaguar yourself, and I don't have one, which is a problem I am certainly looking to rectify in the future. But if the likes of a company such as Limited Run, who appeal to niche demographics within gaming, want to organise a port of Alien vs Predator for the Jaguar over to the PlayStation 5, Nintendo Switch or Xbox Series X, then that would be strongly appreciated. So that's my answer for you, Matthew Reese. Alien vs Predator for the Atari Jaguar over to modern hardware. Yeah. Thank you for your kind support. Cheerio.